Just to underline Julia's point about the public and private sectors, what we've heard and what we need is a tremendous amount of public entrepreneurship, a very proactive state, but it has to go with private entrepreneurship. So public and private entrepreneurship is what creates the economy. So I think that's what I take away from these 2 days. There's a lot of activity on both sides, and the answer lies in there somewhere. Just one more practical point, and that's Chinese finance in Africa. China is offering to connect up Africa with all kinds of infrastructure that it knows how to do from China. There is the FOCAC coming up in December, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation. What will happen to this agenda? What will be Africa's response? There's a $2 billion fund in the Africa Development Bank for growing together. What's Africa going to do with that? I think that's a question that we should put into this agenda.
Great. I think there's one right at the other end. I want to get a dozen, so I might start picking on some people if hands don't go up. Just to warn you.
Two quick points. One really exciting thing somebody told me at the tea break was that there's a problem-focused workshop next week in Liberia organised by the Ministry of Finance, and they've now invited the Ministry of Works to that, which I think is a really positive thing. And the second thing is just a plug for the budget website in Uganda, budget.go.ug, which is a fantastic tool for showing what's spent at the local level. And I think things like that are tools which could promote both accountability and transparency. Thank you.
Yeah. One right in the middle, I think.
The biggest news was from China. And in their 13th five-year plan, which just started, they're planning to join the world through bullet train. I'm quite surprised the amount of money which China is planning to spend on their 5 corridors. We didn't discuss about that because money is not, looks like is not an issue, not a problem.
What else? Any other reflections? There we are. We've got it just on the right there. This is, in a sense, practical points. What do we take away? Or indeed, is there anything that you would want to modify or challenge the panel on? Anything, add or disagree if you think it's all a bit too easy and we've concluded too soon?
I don't know about challenges, but I think one of my takeaways was the extent to which a lot of the problems that have been identified are not just about engineering or planning or policy processes or finance, but about the connections between these areas. And it's about how how policymakers need to understand what the financial and the engineering bits of these projects look like in order to do their policy process as well. And likewise, what engineers need to understand in order to, about how policy and financing work in order to be able to plan projects that are kind of resilient to the various challenges that can emerge at that level.
Yeah.
Thanks. Speaking as an engineer from the World Federation, I'm very grateful for you all to educating me in the worlds of finance and infrastructure investment over the course of the last couple of days. And I would agree with our colleague from UCL there on the point made. I mean, there are an awful lot of conferences in the world of engineering about resilient infrastructure, even just within this city. There are an awful lot of conferences going on about infrastructure, and I've barely met anyone in this room before. So I think perhaps the next time CAPE puts on an event like this, maybe there's an opportunity to see if we can bring some sort of serious infrastructure leaders into this conference as well.
I'm really interested to hear, oh sorry, I'll take one, and while the mic's going there, also interested to hear if representatives from government officials here, what they've taken away. Is there anything, either a point that resonates or something useful they've found, or if they've really picked up nothing or there's still unanswered questions, challenge us a bit. We have, one big objective is to try and help you actually with your challenges that you're facing. Anyway, Maya.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd just like to make a point in defence of politicians. I think sometimes there's this idea that's going around, this unspoken assumption that the world would be a better place if it was run by technocrats. and we could get rid of all the politicians and just make some lovely socially optimal, economically optimal decisions. But there's a very important role for politicians, and I think this idea that Jeffrey Spence mentioned yesterday about like political capacity. So when a politician's motivated to make good decisions, and how can technocrats work with politicians to help them make good decisions? Something really important.
Okay, great. We've got Abraham, then Rosalind.
Thank you very much. What I would take away from here is that the ability of the Ministry of Finance to sit and try to distribute the 300 million, which is a government expenditure, manually. It's something that was really missing in the discussion. Sometimes the government has aspiration. It wants to do so many things, but the resources are so limited, which I think came out quite strongly, and that is, where does the government get the money in order for the government to do the thing that it needs to do? The struggle we had in the Ministry of Finance is to tell all the ministries, don't budget for capital, don't over budget. So we are telling them not to dream. We are telling them not to actually have vision. And I think that is one of the most difficult things to see. And this conference talk about money, and money issue is what a government like South Sudan is struggling with all the time. So where will the government get the money if the government has reputational problems or branding issues? If the government is accused of corruption, it's definitely not going to borrow from the IMF, and the IMF is not going to give green line to any commercial bank. So it's another thing that was not addressed here. If the government has reputational issues, where else will it get some sorts of financing? And it definitely needs to actually finance so many things, including infrastructure. That did not come out.
Thank you, Rosalind. I think what I would like to emphasize is the issue of partnerships came up as one of the concluding issues here, but in the discussion over the last 2 days, we've spoken a lot also about PPI, private provision of infrastructure, in Africa as a very important source of financing and of infrastructure provision. But we didn't have anybody from the private sector present to present their perspective on how they do it, why they do it, what are the challenges are they facing, not only from the projects, the private sector side in terms of the operators, but we also needed to have the commercial banks here. Meridian is here, but Meridian is not a commercial bank financing private projects.
Well, no, we are actually we may not be a commercial bank, but we are a commercial infrastructure fund.
No, I understand that, but I'm talking about having the banks here.
The banks in Africa are quite difficult to find, actually.
No, but ODI should, that's a challenge. You should get them here. And you should get the private operators here to talk about how they're doing it and why they're doing it. And that's what's been missing. That's the missing link. If they're a true partner, they should be here.
And I would have been delighted to have talked more about our entire approach to Africa, but I didn't have enough time. So.
We'll give you a closing closing remark. We've got a bit of contention in the room as well, so that's good. We'll take one, two, and then we'll start to build to conclusions. Yeah.
Thank you, Kenyatta Warile. We talked about bankability of projects, and there was also this talk about government not being able to borrow from, say, the World Bank, IMF, because of credibility issues. They go for this international money sharks and borrow at 10 plus interest rates. I would have loved for someone to state, okay, as a country, what do you have to do to improve your credit ratings? You know, what do you have to do exactly? What type of set of behaviors that you have to have so that you are credit worthy and the likes of IMF, World Bank can talk to you and give you concessional loans easily? Thank you.
Great. I'll take Alistair, then Amadou, and then just to put on notice, we've got sort of Philip, Tom and Mark here who have been thinking about this, and what I've asked them to do is to start thinking about what the forward agenda looks like, and a couple of points apiece just to put them on notice of that. We'll come to after Alistair and Amber.
Yeah, can I be slightly contentious? And you know, this private participation in infrastructure, is this a silver bullet again, and are we thinking this is going to solve it? Because infrastructure investment creates enormous value to the beneficiaries, but the state has been unable to capture this or allow the private sector to do it, through pricing and subsidies that don't make sense. So what can be done about that? Because I think it's a political economy problem, not a technical problem. And there are other political economy problems. There's the theft of natural resource revenues, and someone mentioned that the flow out of Africa is greater than the flow in from ODA every year, and that seems to be something worth giving attention to. And then we've got all the collective action problems that hamper the multilateral institutions in terms of their changing their procurement policies and also their financing instruments. So there's a sort of a dead fish smelling under the table somewhere, but can we say anything about how we can resolve these essentially political economy problems?
Thank you very much. Actually, the point I just wanted to make is that it comes always to capacity building, to having the right people in government. You cannot make the entire government, all the civil servants, make them extremely competent experts. You have hundreds of thousands of people, but at least you can have some units, 1 or 2 units, that have the best talent you can find, that are motivated, that are paid properly, because talent costs money. You cannot attract top talent with the civil servant salaries. Somebody has to pay for it. Either it is the government directly to fight the politicians and to make the political case and say, these people, I allow them to be paid exceptionally, and it is coming from the budget. Or donors, DFIs, others should have facilities to pay those people. They are not consultant. They are part of the government. So they are owners who are competent. It's different from having external consultants advising government officials or advising units. You need the government official or the units themselves to be owners who are competent. This is very important. Number 2, governments in Africa, in the developing world, and I think it's even valid in the developed world, must have this investor mentality. You cannot have maybe both within the same department, but you need to have a unit of the government who is an investor, that thinks like an investor, that cares about financial returns, that cares about maximizing each dollar that the government is putting into the system. And then you need to have the classical government where you're a regulator, you're handling defense, security, and other things. You need to have both. But so far in Africa, what I have noticed, most of the governments don't have the investor mentality because they're not trained for that. They don't know about it. It's rocket science. It's like speaking Chinese to them. And it's normal because they never got the exposure. They never thought about it. And therefore you need to have the separate unit owned by the government, acting on behalf of the government, but that is acting like a private investor that is not getting special benefits from government. Like that unit should pay taxes, should compete with private sector on an arm's length basis. But only they are doing it on behalf of the government. And all the returns from that unit should go help the government get a bigger budget, number 1, but also to effectively manage government assets. If you look at around the world, governments have dormant assets, trillions of dollars. Somebody estimated that the dormant assets of the governments around the world is around $75 trillion. If you apply it to African governments, you get, few hundreds of billions. So if those assets are managed properly by the investor unit, it will generate returns that you can apply to social benefits. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm just going to, I think Francesca wants to come in on the way past, and then we'll do it the other way. We'll get building our agenda, and we'll have a final word from the panel each.
Okay, thank you. Francesca Di Mar from the European Commission. Just to say that I really enjoyed these 2 days. As everybody says, it's a very complex issue to tackle. Maybe there's one dimension that maybe we can all agree that can run through. If you look at the whole public investment chain, if you want, and if you can agree that transparency could be one element that could really tie every of these steps together. So if you think in transparency in, first of all, the objectives that one wants to attain when you want to do a public investment, is it economic integration, regional integration, is it social inclusion, economic inclusion, etc. Transparency in criteria of project selection, I think that could, really is a critical element of, being very clear with the public. This is the basis upon which I am selecting a project. Awarding procurement, going back to your point of procurement, being clear on how the procurement is done of this investment, being transparent on the contractual side is also important, and also following on with the execution, knowing who the contractor is, and the monitoring of these projects. How are these benefits really being achieved or not. So if we can use the word transparency throughout this chain, that could maybe make us move a little bit on the agenda. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, very, very quick.
I'll transition into
okay.
the agenda.
Yeah, literally as you're passing the...
Yeah. I just wanted to say that we've spoken a lot about coherence, and I like that there are common themes that are coming out, and sort of common recommendations like transparency, but also very clear procedural steps that we think are good. In that, I think we shouldn't forget very specific country contexts that really matter, and that different countries have very different challenges. I mean, we had the very interesting juxtaposition of Liberia and Ethiopia in the beginning. Oh, and by the way, I work for AGI in Liberia. So, and then we had this conversation about different financing vehicles and all these kind of things. In Liberia's case, there are no sovereign wealth funds. We don't have access to non-concessional funding. It's a very, very special case that requires very, very different answers from, I think, the general gist that comes out of this conversation. So as a way forward, I just also want to make sure that we don't fall in the trap of best practices around the world, but that we are aware of country contexts and solutions that are different in different countries.
Thank you. I think it's interesting that there were some very sort of broad and important principles and cautions from the panel, and then some quite specific practical points that came in that from across the room, and I'm really interested to see what comes out. And not too much disagreement. Probably more points that we still need to work on. I was hoping it looked like it was all going to be too easily solved. But what we want to do now is build towards the agenda. I mean, collectively, over the next 12 months, what do we take from this conference that is our forward-looking agenda that we want to collectively, jointly, collaboratively work on? Let's start with getting the core team here, ODI London. What does some of this look like? This sort of Philip, Mark, and Tom. Take a point or two apiece, put you on the spot, and then we'll come back to the panelling and we'll work it back this way.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I mean, I will do one or two. I very much welcome Richard's point about more assessments, better diagnosing systems for investment management. I suppose something I'm interested in is kind of trajectories of improvement. So where countries like Korea, like Ethiopia, like China, some of the examples we've heard about what we can learn from how they've actually kind of moved forward, where they've made progress, what kind of have been the capabilities that they've focused on, because a lot of progress has happened when they haven't been perfect at everything, I think is one thing. A second thing is sort of building on that information point. We've heard a lot about sort of pivoting to delivery and implementation. And I think there is scope to just understand much better at the kind of project level what constrains implementation, really starting to get a better understanding in country. Why do projects go wrong? Where does under-execution happen? And that needs to be done at a country level, a sector level, a project level. You can't come out with sort of generalities for it. So those are quite helpful for me.
I think sort of building on that theme of talking about how countries develop capabilities in public investment management. I think just drawing a contrast between what we discussed on the first day, where we talked a lot about how you build capacity, and then the cities session today, which hardly mentioned capacity, but talked a lot about the incentives that city governments face and municipalities face. And then if you get the incentives right, then you expect the outcomes to be good. So what will lead countries to take decisions to invest in investing? What are the incentives that they face? And I think one thing that sort of came out more strongly on the first day than I'd perhaps expected is the importance of sort of having your infrastructure planning embedded in a broader economic growth plan. And maybe those plans are not worth for so much for the plan, but the process that they represent in terms of coordinating government and getting government aligned behind a common objective. So I think thinking about what leads countries to invest in investing and what are the incentives that lead to government departments developing those capacities is something to look at.
Right. And finally, Philip, you set us an agenda yesterday, bunch of questions. How have we delivered?
So obviously, this looks like we've choreographed this very delicately. When the reality is that I've been furiously trying to anticipate what Mark and Tom were going to say, so that I knew.
So the real choreography is that I was going to deliver this bit and not get them to do it. So
right. So two entirely self-serving things that I'm taking away from these last 2 days is the first one is this actually seems to be relevant for people in the real world, which is great. Because as PFM people, very often we get together and we talk about things that nobody in the real world cares about because nobody understands what an integrated financial management system is. Everybody understands what a bridge is and why it's good to have them. The second thing, which is even better, is that our work doesn't seem to be done yet. But there is much more for us to work with. So Robert and Richard are now going to go out and are going to do lots of PIM assessments, and we are going to stand on the sidelines and complain about how they're at the same time too comprehensive and yet too narrow and very technocratic. And then once we have a bunch of them, we're still going to put them into a data set and just going to look like, what are the patterns going to look like, and how does this compare? Do they correlate with PIFA or don't they? And
this is meant to be a consensus-building final comment.
But this was the consensus part. And then people in government that we work with are going to tell us that we just did this assessment and we have no idea what to do with it because there's no recommendation part other than what we don't have. And then that is going to give us the space to go and look about what exactly, and I think there Richard is exactly right, because every government is going to have a different set of problems that are going to be in need of answering. And the discussions that we had here today and yesterday just provided a lot of meat and a lot of ideas for where you could start looking and where you could start building more of an evidence base that is just specific to the problems of infrastructure delivery. And it might be for mega projects, it might be for small projects, it might be for countries where the lack of transparency is a problem, it might be for countries where a lack of training is a problem, it might be a country where genuine PFM mismanagement is a problem. And as we accumulate more data, we are going to be able to give better answers. I think there's this manufacturing technique from Toyota, which is called the 5 Whys, where you're saying in the beginning, our bridge hasn't been finished. Why? Because the public investment management system is insufficient, and we did an assessment that told us that. Why is that the case? The case is because there hasn't been enough investment in the infrastructure. Why is that the case? Because the politicians are all useless and we can't do anything about it. Or it's because of this thing and because of that thing. And to just be able to work your way through that chain is something where I don't think we're quite there yet, but we very well might be the next time we talk about public investment in infrastructure in a couple of years' time. And that sounds like a really exciting agenda to work on.
Great.
Consensus.
Well, we'll see. Final word will be the panel. Thank you. We'll come back to the panel, but the reason for pushing that a bit is we really have the sort of spirit, these Cape conferences are not meant to be some experts on the panel telling everyone else the answers. It's meant to be a genuine conversation across the room, and so actually it's really, really valuable to hear that range of perspectives of what people took from that. What I'm going to ask the panel is not to try and respond so much as to say they all came here very much as experts with wide experience, but they also all wear institutional hats. And if there's one thing you take away from the last couple of days, that thinking about your own institutional role, your own institutional mandate, that you're going to do something about or do something with or work on or do differently, what will that be? And then we'll bring it to a close, and we've got about 5 minutes to do this in. We might go in reverse order if that's all right. I don't know whether we go Julia, Robert, Neil, Richard.
Reflecting and listening and perhaps picking up the point that you made, I worry about your conclusions because a lot of work has been done on the analysis of infrastructure and infrastructure projects and why they haven't worked and why they've got problems. And it seems to me that one of the things that I take away is that we, Meridian, must redouble our efforts to bridge the gulf between public and private, that we need to explain further, we need to communicate further, because I think it's a very critical part of taking infrastructure further, that the communities that need infrastructure, we have a single community that takes the benefit of infrastructure, so we shouldn't be splitting it into constituent parts.
Robert.
Yeah, I'm very brief, two very quick things. One is, as I go back to DC, so there's a lot of innovations taking place on the technology side, new technologies, new partnerships and new forms of doing things in partnerships, new financing mechanisms. I mean, I just learned a lot, by the way, today about what's going on in Peru. I was very fascinated by this thing of, the local companies and not paying taxes, but so there's a lot of really interesting innovations. I'm not sure that as institutions we're really catching up on these innovations, and more importantly, as we discuss with our government counterparts, whether we're able to help them think innovatively and in an entrepreneurial sense, and I think that's what's going to be needed. And finally, let me just close on the word around knowledge. We have on our side, since we've been helping governments implement projects for a very, very long time, we understand a little bit about the impediments to implementation, but I don't think we're good at harvesting this knowledge and sharing it with those who need to have it. So those are the kind of two things I take when I go back to DC.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Neil.
Thank you. I was make sure that I say this in a way that Arti is able to tweet. Now, I think it's about governments doing what it is that they are required to do and doing it well. And maybe then investors will come. So things like, being able to table credible budgets, making sure that they strengthen accountability institutions and not undermine those institutions. I think it's about ensuring that information is provided in a transparent way to legislators and citizens, so that accountability can become an active one. And I think it is about governments ensuring that they work very hard at value for money in the expenditure that they incur. And I think it's about not necessarily saying and leaving it in the slogan that governments should be investor friendly, but maybe about governments doing things in a way that creates a conducive environment for investment.
Can you say a word on what CABRI can do to really...
So CABRI works on credible budgets. I mean, it works on strengthening institutions. Value for money is a big focus in a select number of sectors, and budget transparency is a big area.
Sorry, that's an easy plug for you.
And maybe we should be now looking at procurement as well as a major transparency issue. We have a deal.
Well, we filmed that as well, so we'll bring that back in and ask if that really worked. And Richard?
I think in addition to helping, along with the World Bank, helping countries to understand where their public investment strengths and weaknesses lie, I think one thing which we can also do is help countries to learn from each other's successes. And because I think it is much easier and much cheaper to learn from other countries' successes than it is to learn from your own failures. And I think if you'll indulge me, I'll tell you a little story. Which will disabuse you of any notion that Her Majesty's Treasury is a centre of best practice in public investment management, at least when I was there, which was Geoffrey Spence talked about the 2012 Olympics being one of the biggest public investment projects the UK government had ever done. And I remember being in the Treasury back in July of 2005 on a sort of summer's day when it was announced that the UK, that London had won the competition for the 2012 Olympics, and cheers went up all over London and all over the country that we were going to be hosting the 2012 Olympics, with the exception of the budget department of Her Majesty's Treasury, where just groans went up to think, my God, how are we going to possibly afford this thing? Because we had put together in our proposal to the International Olympic Committee a plan which cost £2.3 billion. I think to illustrate the point about the importance of good planning, the need to take a comprehensive approach to engage all relevant stakeholders in the plan, we basically talked to nobody in putting this thing together. So we went out to the engineering community and said, look, we've won the Olympics. We've got a budget of 2.3 billion. Tell us how to do it. And they said, well, you're going to do this in the East End, right? And so we said, yes. And they said, well, the East End's covered in power lines. What are you going to do about those? And we said, well, we're going to leave them then. They said, no, you're not. Those are going to all have to go underground. And he said, also, they said, we built things in the East End. You also know it's full of unexploded Luftwaffe bombs, all of which are going to cost a tremendous amount of money to dig up and diffuse. And so we said, all right, well, don't worry. We're not going to increase our budget. We're going to get a lot of money from the private sector. So we went to the private sector and we said to all the kind of people who advertise for the Olympics, well, in exchange for all the advertising revenue from the Olympics, you'll build all this infrastructure for us. And they said, well, you of course know that you don't get any of the advertising revenue. It all goes to the International Olympic Committee. And we said, no, we didn't know that. And so then we went to the football clubs and we said, well, you'll pay for the stadium, right? Because you'll want to play football there. And they said, well, we don't want to play football in a stadium with a big athletic track around the outside because then the spectators are all too far away. So we don't want your stadium either, and we won't pay for it. So by the time we had done some proper planning and we had talked to all the relevant stakeholders in doing these kind of projects, the budget had gone from £2.3 billion to £9.3 billion. But we did learn from that experience. And by 2 years later, by 2007, we did have a credible budget for the project. We had, I think, some of the best designed institutional arrangements for managing that project, which brought together people from the public and from the private sector, and people who had a lot of experience delivering big infrastructure projects, gave them a credible budget, and in the end, working together, sort of public and private sector, delivered the Olympics on time and on budget, and also won the UK or Great Britain more medals than we'd ever won before in an Olympic competition. So don't let it.
Won a medal from the World Federation of Engineering Organizations.
Well, there you go. So don't let anyone say it wasn't good value for money in the end. But a lot of lessons
so it
were
sounds like
learned.
we've got mega project meets purposive muddling.
Indeed,
on a grand scale. And well, look, thank you, and a great note of which to finish. I mean, on terms of what we're going to do, and a bit of this challenge, we're ODI, so we're all about knowledge. We're committing to trying to get as much of this knowledge as we can, synthesised, communicated, shared. I think we're not going to write a sort of a comprehensive report on everything that was covered. We're going to try and write a more propositional agenda paper, picking up some issues and laying down the gauntlet for ourselves and for others to engage with that. We are trying to be more relevant in terms of the agendas, and hence this focus on not just public investment because we happen to find that interesting, but connected to something that's really rather important like infrastructure. The diversity point, a really interesting point. This is a much wider and broader audience than we would normally have at a conference, but we can do better still, and who are the real private sector actors there. And being propositional and practical. If you do see ODI reports on this subject saying it's all very difficult, context-specific, and probably a bit political, then do write in and tell us that you expect better next time, because we do have a habit of doing that. But I think there's been a lot of eminently practical material here, so we really want to take that back. From my perspective, and this is our 10th one, I think I've been to all of these CAPE conferences. Thank you. There's a huge number of thank yous. I mean, specifically to Mark and Tom and Philip and others who've done all the thinking or the background work, and that was why I deliberately wanted to go to them to summarise rather than me, because I'd be stealing their well-deserved limelight. But this has been an incredibly professionally organised event, which has had precious little to do with me, but to do with a huge team of people, including Julia, Richard, Breege, Michaela, Tom, Sarah, Jem, Myra, Elise, David, Irene, and about 3 times the number of that. You haven't seen them, but there's also the central communications team, Jessica, Hannah, Rebecca, facilities, wonderful food, everything's happened. I'm amazed. I think it's the first event I've been to at ODI where everything started on time and, with the exception of me, finished on time. There's been incredible IT throughout. Gordon Brown tested that to the extreme by roving back across the room. I didn't know anyone could see, but the camera was desperately being moved. So you'll probably see a silhouette of him if you ever watch that online. But we've tested that, and it's come through. So a huge amount. The visual artist who's been harvesting that, there's storyboards outside. Great sort of triumph for us as well. We tend to have a lot of very clever specialists working in the building, and then all sorts of other people who run the place. And our director of people services and HR came up to me yesterday, and he read the storyboards, and he said, I really have understood what you've been talking about for the last 2 days, which is so fascinating. We've appealed to and made that more accessible to an audience than would normally be the case. So that's great. But also, huge thank you to speakers, chairs, great, without exception, great presentations, great material. People, I mean, I think everyone's brought something bespoke to the conference, and that's really, really heartening from our perspective. But also all of you who've spared at least 2 days, plus probably huge amounts of travel time, and to many, many country officials, and I'm sure that the number of engineers and senior officials in the government, there's probably a bit of an infrastructure dip this week, but we hope that will recover. We will probably be doing this again next year, be something to do with financing. We've got some ideas, but if you have any feedback, if you have any suggestions, a topic we should be talking about, an agenda we should be researching, or an agenda we should be engaged on, please do let us know. But please join me in thanking this panel and the organisers over there for a really great 2 days.